Now, good evening, ladies and gentlemen and distinguished guests. My name is Rory Nevin, President of Waterford Institute of Technology, and it gives me great honour today to introduce our latest Professorial, and it's Anne. Of course, we all know Anne very well, and Jordan, and I particularly want to take this opportunity to welcome back Peter as well, and to any of our other former colleagues who've come here tonight to hear Anne's Professorial lecture session. So, look, this is very important to us, and I think we said this before. It's a very, very important time and, I suppose, occasion for an academic institution like ourselves to be able to honour those who have achieved a lot in their academic field is something that's very important and very dear to any higher education institute, and none more so than to WIT, who have a very strong reputation in that regard. And I suppose I would have to say that even though Anne left us a few years ago, we haven't forgotten you, absolutely not. And I suppose tonight is about honouring you on our behalf for all the effort that you placed and put in to your academic career while you're here with us in WIT. And I think it will be important to note that obviously you were head of our Education Development Centre here. You designed and coordinated the Master in Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, and indeed were very involved in a range of approaches to learning and guides for teachers and approaches to creativity. And I always look forward this evening to hearing from you, and it's a very interesting title. It works in practice, but does it work in theory? Very interesting. And twists and turns in educational thinking, a personal narrative. But the most important thing, I think, tonight is to basically say from all of us here at WIT how much of an honour it is for us to be able to welcome back Professor Anne Jordan. And that's all I'd like to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rory. Thanks, Anne. It just, for me, maybe just to have a couple of introductory remarks, if you don't mind, take it a bit of time. I suppose, firstly, just on behalf of the school, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Anne Jordan here to our lecture series tonight. And I'm delighted to see such a turnout, a lot of colleagues from the school, from outside the institute, and past students of WIT. So it's great to see here. Anne has taught across all sectors of education. I was just looking at the brief in terms of in England, Ireland, Europe, and in Asian context. So that's quite a considerable breadth of experience that I hope we'll learn something about in terms of our lecture series tonight. I suppose on a personal perspective, I see some colleagues here that started around the same time as myself. I remember when I first commenced as a lecturer here, and I was reflecting on it back in 1994, 95. A lot of us at this time, there was a whole cohort of us started at the time together, and Anne would have delivered workshops to us at that time as part of a role of supporting the institute in terms of looking at different pedagogical approaches to supporting students in different settings. So that's, shows you the length of engagement that Anne has had within the institute. Anne would have worked closely with other colleagues who are not here who have also left the institute, including Vinnie Martin and Dolores Gilhooly, and many others who would have been pioneers of adult education within WIT, and I suppose within the wider educational context, particularly in the IoT sector as well. So great credit is due there. Rory has touched upon some of the initiatives that Anne played an integral part of in her time within the institute, including the instigator of many of our master's programmes that have grown from strength to strength. That has helped us build capacity for other programmes within the School of Lifelong Learning and Education. Anne worked in the whole area of access and RegSA, and those initiatives are still paying fruits today in terms of how they help and enhance the contribution of the Institute. Externally, Anne would have worked with a number of external agencies, including from the Institute's perspective I'm aware of, NALA and the Literacy Development Centre, and would have contributed to the national debate on lifelong learning back around, I think, circa 2000. It's good to see, obviously, Peter here and her colleague, Professor Orson Carlyle. Both of them were acknowledged. They got honorary professorialships from Tulsa State University in Russia. So it shows you the breadth of experience and engagement that they have contributed. Both of them have, but we're here to acknowledge Anne's great contribution in my respect, so I'd like to acknowledge that. It's a pleasure to acknowledge Anne's work today, and I'm sure the lecture series will be quite interesting, so thank you. Leave it at that.
Good evening, folks, and thank you very much for coming. President John, thank you for coming. Members of the WIT academic community, fellow students, colleagues, friends, present and past students, it is great and it's a delight to see you here. My title isn't a new one. I pinched it from a publication that Orison and I wrote about 10 years ago for a publication called Emerging Issues in University Education. And because we got probably as many citations for it as we did for one of the later books that we wrote, we knew that the topic was of interest, and certainly it's one that's been of interest to us for a long time. So what I really want to talk about today is and I'm not talking about education just at third level, but the way that education thinking drives the practices that we have had, and the way that education thinking and practices have changed and are continually changing, and may of course be problematic for us. So that's my title. The gentleman here is the Danish existential philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who pointed out that it's only when you look back over a long time that you can understand what is happening. And I've had a long time to look back on education. I have to say that I never had a full-time job in WIT. I had to create my own. And I do recommend that people create their own jobs, because it does take you out of your comfort zone. So it meant that I had to be involved in European projects, in sourcing funding from Europe for large-scale projects. It meant that I worked then on training for trainers and lots of other programs, which has given me time to think about what it is that drives educational practices. One of the things I have always wanted, right throughout my career, is to be, as Socrates said, a gadfly, to be a kind of an irritant, maybe I'm a bit of a contrarian anyway, but I've always wanted to kind of deconstruct the kind of rhetoric that you hear in education, and to find out what it means and what it's for. So basically that's been my ambition for a long, long time, and will continue to be my ambition as well. And the kind of themes that run throughout this are kind of three of them really. What kind of values underpin educational thinking? And again, I'm not just talking about education at third level, I'm talking about education in general. What's the role of education in society, and why has there been a decline in the status of teachers and teaching? And I can't answer that, but I have some ideas on it. But first of all, the values. What's education for? I mean, is it to provide people with jobs? In which case we haven't been terribly good so far in predicting what the future job market is going to be like. And even as way back as 1920s, Dewey warned against a very vocational trend in education on the grounds that things changed. Gramsci, the sort of radical Marxist thinker, again said that there is a danger in education being too vocational, especially if you want to promote social mobility and you want to rise the status of all classes in society. Maybe it's for developing the whole person. Maybe, as Cardinal Newman thought, it's for developing Christian gentlemen and gentlewomen. So, yep, that's a nice ideal. Maybe it's to promote or to endorse the major values in society. Maybe that's what education should be doing, in which case it's always going to be a little bit conservative, but then it raises questions as to what those major values are. Or maybe it's to be more radical. Maybe we want our education to be more of a radical force, and I'll come back to that later, I think. The role of education in society has changed enormously. In the 18th century, when new states were casting around to find out sort of who were the best bodies who were able to sort of tame the masses, they thought either of the army or of the religious orders, since they were the two that had most experience in dealing with groups of people. I bet you don't know, for example, that the De La Salle order in France were the first people responsible for one teacher standing in front of a whole group of students. It sounds obvious, that's what teachers always do. But in fact, what he was doing was he was mirroring the kind of thinking of Jeremy Bentham in his idea of the panopticon, which was the one place in the prison where you could look around and you could survey all the prisoners. So the notion of the teacher exercising surveillance goes back to the 18th century. The role of education in society now is enormous. Education has become the main force in social engineering. Education has taken on a responsibility for all elements in society in a way that it didn't in earlier times. And this creates, I think, a problem for us as educationalists, because now education has to deal with everything. You know, should we teach kids about mortgages? Should we teach people about health? Should we teach people about citizenship? One state in Australia decided a few years back that they were going to give all the 16-year-olds in the state driving lessons, so everyone would learn to drive safely. And you can guess what happened. The rate of accidents went up after a couple of years, because the teenagers thought that driving was about knowing the techniques of driving, whereas what we really know is that driving is about exercising judgment in driving. And if the prefrontal lobes in the brain sort of aren't fully formed until you're in your mid-20s, then it's a bit too early just to teach those techniques without anything else. But the fact remains that education now carries a huge burden, which means that it's rather odd that there seems to have been a decline in the status of teaching and of teachers, given the sort of increased role that we now have. There may be lots of reasons for this. I mean, maybe there are just too many of us around. Maybe it's the fact that there isn't the respect for authority anyway that you had in earlier ages. Or maybe it's to do with the kind of thinking that we endorse. Piaget, for example, the noted child psychologist, said that teachers got in the way of children's learning. So the best thing to do was to leave them out of it, because children had to discover the world for themselves. And if teachers came along and provided them with answers, then that wasn't a good thing. Carl Rogers, the eminent psychotherapist, American psychotherapist in the 1980s, said, "I can't teach anyone anything. All I can do is to be a facilitator." And you notice that these days we tend to talk about teachers as being facilitators. In fact, when we, 10 or 11 years ago, when a group of us in WIT developed our first master's program in teaching and learning, we didn't call it teaching and learning, we called it learning and teaching, because we didn't want to give the impression that sort of teaching was more important than learning. So I can't give you an answer as to why that decline is there, but certainly over the last few years you do notice that, and I am aware that we're beginning now to sort of to come out of that, and we're beginning to get now an increasing respect for the teacher as expert, the teacher as carrying of the sort of the subject, etc. There are lots of problems with thinking in education. And one of the problems is because it doesn't have any coherent set of theories attached to it. If you look at the whole list of subjects from which education draws its theories, you can see there's a whole lot of them. Starting with philosophy, Plato, who said that ideas were the only things that mattered, highly meritocratic because lots of us aren't capable of absorbing ideas. On the opposite end of the scale, people like Rousseau in the 18th century, who was all for child-centred education. In the 20th century, the two major theories, and theories that are still very much in use, although we may not be so highly conscious of them, is a theory called behaviorism. If you remember Pavlov and his dog, and the way that he was able to observe the way the dog responded to the gong ringing for lunch, you'll see behaviorism started a huge trend in teaching different animals and organisms how to learn. In fact, they called it the theory of learning because they thought it was the only one. And the way that it worked was that you needed to know what the stimulus was, what motivated people. You needed to know how to reinforce that, how to build it up. You needed to know what kind of reward or punishment you were going to you were going to give. And the main point was that you were modifying people's behaviour. You didn't care how they thought or what they thought about. It was their behaviour only that mattered. And it was responsible for when people began to design programs in the 1960s, the 1970s, 1980s, it was based on this form of behaviourist teaching. It began to get a very bad name. If anyone anyone ever read The Clockwork Orange or seen the film The Clockwork Orange, it's an attack on behaviorism. If you are in a college and you use the concept of learning outcomes, which drives a lot of the programs that we actually use. Learning outcomes tell you what a learner will be able to do at the end of a program. They're entirely behaviorist. Even although the theory now has got a very bad name. I did very badly in a PhD thesis I was submitting to a university here back in the 1980s because it was too behaviorist. So behaviorism bad, but behaviorism also good. The opposite of behaviorism is a theory called constructivism. And constructivism says that everyone has different experiences of the world, that we build our own mental models or schema or scripts based on the experiences that we have. And since we all have different experiences, we're all going to be very different in the way that we we approach the world. And constructivism for the last 20 or 30 years has been the most predominant theory of learning. It stresses learner-centeredness. It stresses difference, whereas behaviorism stresses sameness. Now, you can see that there's an input from lots of other subjects as well. But one thing I'd like to say is that education's become big business. It's a marketable product. There is lots of money to be made out of developing different kinds of instruments or to be presenting different kinds of material. When my colleague and myself, when we were writing the book Approaches to Learning that you can see there, we were paying for permission for lots of diagrams, often from American authors. And we approached, one author has a copyright on a circle. It's got 4 exit points in it, but it's still a circle. And we asked permission to use his diagram. And the answer we got back was that it would cost us $160. Now, we'd already been paying out loads of dollars, so we thought we'd do it ourselves. And so my colleague, naively, I think, sort of sent them a message back and said, thanks, but we'll do our own version of it. And the reply came back in a flash, you do and we'll sue. This is another element then that has come into the educational mix. Education is now business. It's now big business, and its products are now big business. One of the problems is, of course, that if you don't know what the theories are that you're using or that drive your practices, you may be at the mercy of either educational fads, or you may be at the mercy of people who are trying to sell you something. So we have claimed that you need to be aware of the kind of clashes that may arise if you hold bits and pieces of theory. It's a form of what the French call bricolage, where you have a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of the other. And you really need to know where these ideas are coming from. A few years ago, the OECD wrote a nice little book on neuromyths, because they realized that the flavor of the last few years has been from neuroscience. What's actually happening in the brain, since we now have imaging techniques and we can see what happens. We know a lot more now about the way that memory works, etc. But they identified about 6 or 7 neuromyths. One was the myth, I don't know where it comes from, that we only use about 10% of our brains, that somewhere there's another 90% that isn't actually doing anything. Another one is that there are different kind of learning styles. Now, many of my students would be devoted to the idea that people have different learning styles, and it seems logical. But cognitive scientists say, no, we perceive the world in the same kind of ways. There is another one, my favorite, and I won't mention the group who runs it, are a movement that claims that there are brain buttons that you can stimulate in order to increase the flow of blood to the brain. And I was once at a talk to the Chamber of Commerce in which a trainer came down to show us how to use these brain buttons. There are a couple of them that are located near the sort of the breastbone, and you have to, if you stimulate them, you get a rush of blood, and that will help you to think more clearly. I recommend you to Google, look up brain buttons, and look up a Jeremy Paxman interview with their founder to see what the evidence is for their working. The reason we wrote the books that we did was that we wanted to understand for ourselves what was going on in terms of educational thinking. We wanted to be clear about it. Right, that's the general picture. I want now to look at different sectors of education. And I want to start with looking at my own personal experience or the experience of my family. And I've called this What Goes Around Comes Around because I think somehow it was the title of a Martin Amis novel, or if not the title, it was sort of at the beginning of the novel. And I want to go back to the 1930s in the Midlands in England, where my father, an Irish immigrant, was working. He was a colliery surface worker. And he and lots of other people, working men and women, used to go every Friday night to a pub in Stoke, where they would hear people who came up from Oxford University. And these people talked about politics, they talked about philosophy, they talked about economics. There's a degree in Oxford called PPE, which is politics, philosophy and economics. So the Master of Balliol would come up to Stoke and he would talk to these working men and women. They would write essays sometimes. Now, the people from Oxford weren't paid for this work. They did it out of a kind of philanthropy, sometimes called the idealistic the idealistic era of adult education. The students, like my father, didn't expect to get better jobs out of it. They wanted to understand the way that the world worked. And they wanted to understand what it was that was causing the depression and the rest of it. Many of them, like my father, were either extreme socialists or were communists. And I'm reminded that just at the same time that the Master of Balliol was coming up to Stoke, then some Cambridge dons were also recruiting double agents, people with names like Burgess and Maclean, etc., to send them off to foreign embassies. 20-odd years later in the 1960s, well, 30-odd years later, I suppose it was, I just graduated and I did a bit of part-time work for the Workers' Educational Association, who had been responsible for this work. And I found myself teaching a group of elderly ladies. I think we were doing literature, and I've got a feeling that we were doing D.H. Lawrence. They never asked me any questions about D.H. Lawrence. I probably wouldn't have been able to answer them anyway, but they would nod encouragingly, and they would say, on occasions, they'd say, "That's right, Duck." So it gave me a huge incentive to go on. I was tremendously pleased with this. I have a memory that they were knitting, but I might have mixed that up with the French Revolution, with something I read about it. But once again, they were the remnants of those. They were all ex-members of the Communist Party. They were the remnants of those ladies, men and women, who'd been around in the 1930s and were still there. 10 years later, I think that group had entirely disappeared. It was therefore sort of depressing by the time you got to the 1980s to find that adult education had been entirely commodified. It had been taken over by the colleges, but the colleges needed to make money out of it. They needed to pay the tutors, they needed to pay the overheads, etc. So the kind of liberal adult education that had been possible in earlier times was no longer on offer. In fact, colleges began to talk about them rather dismissively as hobby courses, and they didn't look for them. By and large, then, adult education tended to be sort of looking at professional and vocationally based courses. So it looked as though that was the end of an era, and certainly for the humanities, as though that was the end of it. But look what has happened. That philanthropy returned. We now have a huge number of free online, massive open online courses that are being offered in America through a body called Coursera, which sort of includes universities like Harvard, Yale, etc. A huge plethora of universities involved in offering entirely free courses on any kind of subject. You can do assessments in them, you can be assessed in these as well. The only thing you may pay for is if you want accreditation. In the same way, then, the TED Talks, which again are a wonderful series of talks. I'm sure sort of many of you have watched the TED Talks and will know them. They're entirely free. You only pay if you want to go to them. If you want to go and mix with the great and good and network, that's when you pay. So there has been a resurgence. And finally, what is really nice, I think, is the fact that groups and communities are coming together themselves and determining to run their own courses. I'm involved with one in Clonmel, and I see many people here from that course tonight, in which there is no involvement with any other formal educational provider of any kind. The groups decide on their subject matter, they decide on their own tutors, they decide on their own payment, etc. And it's wonderful. It's lovely. So maybe again we have got a resurgence. By the way, beware of weasel words. I saw recently that there was a celebration of lifelong learning. That sounds great, lovely. Lifelong learning is an OECD word, and it doesn't actually mean lifelong learning. It means work-long learning. So if by chance you see a course advertised with your local education provider that offers you lifelong learning opportunities, that's fine as long as you're in the labour market or you're heading for the labour market. If, like me, you may be beyond it, then it's not for you. Again, it's another way that education is being sort of turned in a particular direction. So that's adult education. I want to move back now to primary education to look at the kind of thinking, what's happening in these different sectors. So I'll try and do this fairly quickly. In the 1950s, when I was about 9, I was a pupil at a very small convent school, private convent school, fees £3 a term, I think, or was it £3 a year? Can't remember. And it only taught 3 subjects. Well, I think religion was possibly the 4th. It was run by an Irish order of nuns. We did maths, we did English, and we did reasoning. And the reason was, of course, that we were being prepared for the 11+ examination, which determined whether you went to a grammar school or to a vocational, a secondary modern school. It was incredibly intensive. I have never worked as hard ever in my life as I did at the age of 9. And it was a good preparation for future life. It was not child-centred. There were masses of things that we didn't do and we'd never even heard of. I'm not sure that we missed them either particularly, but what I do remember from that experience was the rigour and the intensity. And it's interesting that last year, when the Chief Inspector of Schools in Ireland was asked what worked in education, one of the things that he talked about was time on task, was the fact that children needed to sort of learn the sort of rigour and to stick at it. We did 3 hours of homework a night at that age. We didn't think it was odd. I think now that people might think it was odd. 20-odd years later, maybe 25 years later, my 9-year-old son went to a little Catholic school in the middle of a council house estate in Middlesbrough, an industrial city in the north of England. It's a lovely little school, very friendly, very child-centred, lots of subjects, but they didn't do homework. Nope, that was too divisive. It caused problems between parents and kids if you did homework with them. And I realised at the time that unlike my Irish nuns, in the instance I was talking about, that they had no great expectations of the children, that the steelworks were still in operation, that the mines were still there was plenty of work in retail, etc. 10 years later, those jobs had gone. So it makes me wonder now what happened to those. This was the child-centred age, if you like, of education. It was nice, it was friendly, it was lovely, but it made no demands. Okay, forward another 20-odd years to my 9-year-old granddaughter in London, in a North London primary school. So what's happening there? Well, now they have SATs tests. They have a whole mass of subjects because schools these days take on lots and lots of stuff. But they also have testing in maths and in English. And what they do is they have Skype contacts with India. So if a kid has problems with maths, then they Skype over to a tutor in India who will help with the maths. And one of the reasons for this kind of intensity, and it is intense now again, is the fact that it's extremely difficult to get into good London schools. There is now, the 11 plus is gone, but there is now testing, schools can discriminate. There are loads of highly motivated Asian students and their parents who are likely to take the best places. So it is really hard to get into these schools. So once again, they are having to work very, very hard. But it's not the same as my first experience because they've got a massive other stuff to do as well. So the kind of issues that this raises are, of course, curriculum overload, the way that primary schools now are having to cope with so much. Reading. Constructivism, which was at its height in the 1980s and 1990s, suggested that phonics, which was the old traditional method of reading, it was probably the way that you learned to read, by sound, by putting together the sounds, was rote learning. Can't have rote learning, too old-fashioned. Maybe what you need is whole word, where kids recognise the whole word, and then they can begin to read, to sort of construct. It's more exciting, it's more realistic, etc. Well, now, the problem with that, of course, was that standards of reading fell. And the English government had to issue an order that said that phonics, certainly in the early years, had to come back. So that boring rote learning had to return. A few years ago, my colleague was approached by Parent Teachers Association by a guy who was going round the schools and telling people that phonics was dead and that whole word reading was what you should do. So what were they to do? What was the answer? And again, people didn't know, and people often don't know because we're confused. We don't know what the theories are behind these. The same thing happened with discovery learning in maths, where you discovered the laws of commutation. That's when you move figures from one side of a thing to the other. Kids had to discover the laws of commutation by themselves. Rather than being given the rule or the formula, you were left to discover it. Confusion on confusion. Discovery has now been abandoned for much later. So it looks as though that period, we've come through that period where people were saying, well, you know, you can't have people memorizing, you can't have people rote learning, you must have them discovering. Certainly in terms of the basic subjects, it might have gone. So what's happening in secondary education? Well, I don't know, I'm not involved in secondary education these days, but I do know that in the 1960s, a group called Hurst and Peters, two people sat down and they worked out what looked like a very simple system, which was that primary education should really be a way of enforcing the sort of the basic literacies and numeracies, and giving people a sort of incentive to, giving children an incentive to be at school. And then they said that secondary education should be about people learning the ways of thinking in these subject areas. It strikes me now that you wouldn't have these same subject areas today. I doubt if anyone does anything much in philosophy in schools, though I should like them to. Maybe there is art, and then they said that third level education should develop, you know, your knowledge and expertise in one particular subject area. This was disputed at the time on the grounds that it was going to be too difficult for many people and that school should basically be more vocational. But we've already seen and we know now the problems with vocational education. in the way that jobs are changing so rapidly. We're still at the mercy of constructivism, and I say at the mercy of constructivism because concepts like student-centred learning sound fine. They sound great. If what you mean by that is that the learning is directed towards, attention is directed towards what the student does. It's when you talk about its opposite as being teacher-centred learning or content-centred learning that it becomes rather difficult. And again, the Chief Inspector of Schools said last year that one of the things that worked was teacher-directed learning. Student-centred learning often meant that people were doing projects, death by project sometimes, loads and loads of projects. It also meant maybe that people were involved in lots of group work, and that the teacher then was a facilitator of group work. Again, that's fine, provided it's not overdone. I'm reminded again of my colleague who once went to London on a weekend, was doing his PhD, and he went for a weekend on research methods. And the whole weekend was conducted by means of group work. So you didn't actually get any direct instruction in anything, but you talked to your groups about what you already knew. He came back at the end of that time very cross that he'd spent a lot of money sort of going there and he hadn't actually learned anything very much. So while I certainly don't have problems with group work, then I think that you do have to be careful about the extent to which you do it. There are other, I won't call them a fad, but there are other things that have been incredibly pervasive in schools and also in colleges. Multiple intelligences theory is one. Multiple intelligences theory, which is promoted by the American psychologist Howard Gardner, says that there are about 8 or 9 different intelligences. I hope they don't discover many more of them because they keep adding ones now and again. Multiple intelligences theory attacks the notion that there is a general intelligence, sometimes called G. And the reason it attacks the notion there's a general intelligence, sometimes called G, is because it's largely heritable. And in a democratic age, we don't really want to endorse notions that intelligence is fixed or is heritable. Now, in many ways, it's an entirely benign theory. And it's particularly useful if you want to direct teachers to looking at the different strengths that people have. But when you call them intelligences, it becomes somewhat difficult. In fact, intelligence now is such a highly political word that you can't use it. And you certainly can't use it in America, where 2 people who wrote a book called The Bell Curve lost their jobs when they claimed that people of African origin have an IQ rating that's slightly less than that of the general population. So again, there's dangerous stuff here. Right, higher education. Procrustes, you can see him there wielding the sword, was an evil mythical blacksmith in ancient Greece who had constructed an iron bed, and he made you fit into it. So if you were too long, he chopped your legs off, and if you were too short, he stretched you. One of the questions that we need to ask is whether, when we are dealing with higher education, we are either stretching or constricting our students. Are we making them fit into our Procrustean bed? What happens at the moment is that we have a system of modularization. Modularization developed in the States back in the 1940s, 1950s. It's quite easy to run. It's administratively easy. It suggests that all the learning that you do will be done within 13 weeks. You do it within that time, it's done and dusted in that time, you take the examinations, then you can pass on either to another subject or to a more advanced version of what you're doing. Does it suit the way that people learn? When I was a student in the 1960s, I had a philosophy professor, Tony Flew, a very well-known philosophy professor. I didn't understand a word of what he was talking about. It took me 30 years to get that. Had there been modules around in my day, I would certainly have failed. I would certainly have failed that module. And yet we assume that all learners will learn within that particular time period. Now, if on the one hand we're saying that all people are different, then perhaps should we not also be saying that we learn at different rates and at different times? What allowance does it make for failure? What chance do you have to fail and to try again? You know, if we think about creativity, people like Edison, or a recent guy that I heard, Craig Ventnor, who's talks about artificial life, said that his teams fail 99% of the time, but they carry on. But we don't build in allowance for that. Now, I suspect we're in a kind of an interim period in which at the end learning will become much more personalised. For example, one of the things we're now aware of is that many more of us than would have been recognised in the past might have some form of cognitive deficit. You know, we might have problems with attention, we might have ADHD, or we might have dyslexia, or we might have dyspraxia, etc. And currently, allowance is made for that if you can get the right kind of evidence for it. But if, as has been suggested, 1 in 4 of us has this some form of deficit, how on earth can systems and how on earth can we cope within standardized systems? So it looks as though they will have to change. One thing I'd like to say, of course, about institutes of technology like this is that we have been remarkably successful institutions. Not always by deliberate design by the policymakers, but we've been remarkably good in responding to the needs of our regions and in providing the kind of education that people want. And the issue is, to what extent we'll be able to do that in the future, or will we need to change again and to change radically? One area that people have suggested over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years is the idea of transferable skills. Really what we are doing is that we're developing in our learners a set of generic skills, you know, like skills in communication, like skills in group work, teamwork, skills in critical thinking. And the idea is that these skills will transfer from the classroom or the academic situation into real life. People are now beginning to have doubts about that, because it looks as though if skills are going to transfer, the situations in which they are have to be highly similar. I have an example. It's a rather silly example of that, but it's one that certainly shocked me. About 20-odd years ago here, I was running a course on thinking skills for primary school teachers. And it was the first morning of the course, and we were doing some reading. I was reading something aloud, and I got tired of doing it, and I looked to the person next to me and said, will you carry on reading? And the person didn't do it. So I looked to another person, and I said, sorry, would you mind reading the next bit? And they wouldn't do it, and I could see by the way their arms were folded they weren't going to do it either. So I forgot, and I thought, oh well. And I carried on and I read whatever it was myself. And at the end of the session, a small delegation came up to me and they said, "We've got a complaint to make about you." And I said, "Why? What's that?" And they said, "You asked us to read out loud in public, in front of other people." And I said, "But you're teachers, you do that all the time." "Ah," they said, "yes, but not in front of other adults and not in public when we don't know each other." And it was the first time I began to realize that skills may not transfer as easily as you might assume. I would like to think that there are transferable skills. I would like to think that we could transfer skills in thinking and in logic, but I just don't know. And the last point I'd want to make about higher education is the kind of grade inflation that is now going on. When I was a student, it was very common for people to get a third-class degree. Most people got a 2-2 degree, I think. Now I suspect that most people get either a first-class degree or an upper second degree. And there's evidence that in England, students don't turn up to their degree awarding ceremonies if they get a 2-2 because they feel that they have failed. And it raises the question as to why we have this public demonstration of degrees. I know that high flyers might like it, but for the rest of us, we might not be happy to get our 2-2s or our third-class degrees, etc. One suggestion that was made a few years ago was that degree awards at bachelor's level should be like the driving test. You either pass it or you fail it. Now, behind that, you could have a transcript that said entirely how you did, but it wouldn't be public. But certainly now, I think for many teachers and for many lecturers, grade inflation becomes a serious problem, maybe exacerbated by employers who say, "Send me a list of your people with first-class degrees," etc. So we're doing their work for them. Okay, that's higher education. So what's coming down the tracks? Very quickly. Findings from the newer disciplines. We now know a lot more than we did about the differences between novices and experts. Most people now know about the 10,000 hours rule, which is the time it's been estimated that it takes someone from beginning in a subject to becoming a master in that subject. I once calculated that if you take into account a whole school career that might lead up to a PhD, it's roughly about 10,000 hours. I tried doing it with the idea of the apprenticeship as well, and I think that works too. There's a nice study that comes from a conservatoire in Berlin where they looked at music students, and they looked at the amount of time that they spent in practicing and what happened to them afterwards. And they could divide them into 3 groups. There was one group who practiced the most, 8 hours a day or more, as you might do if you're a violin student. And these people went on to become solo violinists, invariably. They looked at a middle group. This was the group that maybe practiced 4, 5, 6 hours a day. And they went on to play in orchestras, invariably. And then they looked at people who didn't practice that much, maybe 3, 4 hours a day. You need to practice a lot if you're a violin teacher. If you're a violinist, sorry. And they went on to become music teachers. Sorry, teachers. But one of the things we now know is the importance of practice. And I think we have to be careful when people talk about memorization and rote learning, that we need to separate those. It's not mindless. You know, even Aristotle said that that virtue is a matter of practice rather than an intellectual capacity. It's the importance of practice. And there have been loads of books written. One by called Bounce that some of you might know, which was written by a table tennis champion. And he talks about the hours doing it again and again and again and again until you get it right. Somehow I think we are returning to the concept of the teacher as the expert, as the master. We are returning to rather more rigorous systems because we're beginning to understand that memorization is not simply rote learning. One of the things that is happening is, of course, and we don't really know the end of this, is the enormous impact of online learning and the changes that it has already made. A colleague of mine from another institute last year wrote an article which was picked up by many of the major papers, and it said, full-time college education for all, a luxury we can't afford. And what frightened me in that was the words for all, because I could envisage a situation in which the privileged and the wealthy would still go to Harvard or Oxford or UCD or WIT, and then the rest of us, those of us dependent on grants, etc., would be told that we could have the virtual version of that. And they're not the same. You know, the experience of being at college is a really important one. And if we deny it to people, or if we say it's too expensive, then, you know, is the virtual one, no matter how good it is, and of course they are good, many of them, you can get discussion groups and all the rest of it, but I don't know, I'm not sure. Finally, just one thing. A guy called Craig Venter, who is the creator of synthetic DNA, digital DNA. When he was in Dublin 2 years ago, he showed a video of a lock-up garage in California. It was a chemistry lab, and it was full of people. Some of them teenagers, some of them grannies or grandpas, and they were all working with DNA. You probably don't know you can buy fragments of DNA now. Now, I don't think you can buy fragments of DNA from advanced organisms, etc., but you can buy, and certainly you can't buy human DNA, of course, but you can buy bits of DNA. And what these people were doing was that they were working with synthesizing with these fragments of DNA. And Venter said, what these people are now able to do is the equivalent. 5 years ago, a couple of people got the Nobel Prize in biology for creating a new kind of species where they altered the colours in a jellyfish, and he talked about the tremendous possibilities that would arise from this. But the thing is that the people in that lab hadn't been through formal systems in order to get that knowledge. There is an incredible explosion of knowledge out there. There is an incredible explosion of interdisciplinary knowledge, particularly in biology, computing, engineering, that whole area of medical devices, that whole area of artificial intelligence is beginning to be of interest again, creating small creatures that can eat big data. There is a huge world out there. And finally, to finish, what I would like is that I would like a broader debate on what all this is for and how it is for and where we are going. We may get it wrong, but we need the debate. One of the things that I have been pressing for is philosophy in schools. I think it probably will. I think they probably will develop a syllabus for this, as they do in other countries. As it is, I have to ban my own students at the moment from using the word opinion, because everyone has opinions, and people tend to think that everyone's opinion is as good as everyone else's, and that opinion takes the place of argument. And what I would like is a more rigorous system that would include more argument and more debate. Thank you. If this is a one-sided and biased view of education, then of course it is that. And I wouldn't expect that it should go unchallenged either.
I'd like to thank Anne for what was a very thought-provoking and interesting lecture. Just as I reflected on it, Anne touched upon the values underpinning education thinking, the role of education in society in terms of social engineering, and also questioning what education should be about. And a couple of anecdotes. At Academic Council, Anne, you would have been a raucous sense at some of the discussions about learning outcomes, where the debate got down to will or should. Yes. And I think your example of the teachers not being willing to talk, because you could argue they all will as part of the thing, would have actually clarified a lot of the discussion, and maybe the continuing debates that we're having would not be as a result. So it would have been a raucous sense. When you touched upon what goes around comes around, I keep thinking about things like history repeating itself. And I think that was the theme you were picking up as part of that. So I thought it was quite interesting. You touched on the commodification of education, I think, and that's a challenge we as educators do have to address, and I fall into that trap because I have our president here and I have a financial controller to deal with and other things which are driving those types of things, and it needs people to question me and others as regards that. So I think that was really interesting. I think you touched on Malcolm Gladwell in terms of the 10,000 hours and the expertise, and if you're reading Malcolm Gladwell's book, it's quite interesting because the likes of Bill Gates was a dropout. Look where he's got today, you know, all of those type of things. When you touch on multiple intelligences, I reflect on it and think it's quite interesting because I've used the example of David Beckham. There's a movie out, Bend It Like Beckham, and one of the intelligence they would say is Beckham's skills and abilities, and look what that's brought him in some respects. And I suppose the final thing I thought about, and it's my own personal experience, when you talked about the role of education in society in terms of social engineering, as someone who's interested in history and reading around social history in particular, people talk about Donogh O'Malley and when he brought in free education, that some people have argued that it's one of the biggest contributors to the economic growth of Ireland in terms of society. And as a beneficiary of that somewhat later, who worked in York and Yorkshire, and was a quite unusual being on a construction site, the paddy engineer. The expectation was that I would be in the trench, not as the engineer actually saying to people, this is what you need to do or whatever, trying to assist. Sure. And I was a beneficiary of the change that education provided, because a lot of the people I was dealing with were actually Irish immigrants from the 50s who were never afforded the opportunities that I would have had as a result of education. So I think the discussion has been quite thought-provoking. I'd just like to, on behalf of everyone, thank you for attending and giving this lecture series, and to welcome people. We have tea and refreshments outside, so it's a chance to mingle and talk and maybe catch up again. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Mike. Just to remind you that Thomas Piketty, the French economist, points out that social mobility, which he thought education had contributed to, after the Second World War, he thinks is now at an end. So sorry to be sort of dismal again, but again, it may be something else we need to think about.